talked about my mother a few times in videos, and my brother as well. My dad died further back in 2013, so I haven't talked as much about him. But now that they're all gone, I felt that it was time for a post-mortem on this thing that my parents created that is now dead. What breeders call a family. I call it an injustice, but I am in the minority opinion, as are you if you are an antinatalist. This video will be part memoir and part warning to potential parents. This is how your little experiments turn out. This is the kind of damage you impose because you thought it would be fun. You did no research, no critical thinking, and cared nothing for the consequences. This video was in part inspired by a video Mendham made in 2017. It was about the death of his father. My dad died 4 years earlier, so I could very much relate to it. Nevermore was the title of the video, and it was so emotional and heavy because it was about his life, not just life in general, but his life. And when it comes to our own life, it's hard not to get a bit choked up. I was also inspired by a Japanese YouTuber by the name of The OED Loves Me Not, who made a video for the Why Are You an Antinatalist contest that included him talking about his parents and family history. I appreciate that they are both willing to share their personal life with us, rather than just talking about impersonal philosophy. I always knew that I would talk about my personal life in these videos, because how could I not share what my own experience of being alive is like? It's the only life that I've witnessed every single second of. This is the death of the family, because from 2021 on, I'm not a part of that social group anymore, because I'm the last member, and you can't have a family of one. All three members of my family had hard 15-year goodbyes. That is around 15 years from a diagnosis until it got worse, and then it got intolerable, and then it got really disgusting, and offensively intolerable, and then it gets to the point where, fuck, I wish I wasn't alive to see this. And then, it's finally over. That's how it was for my family. For some others, it's quick. I have friends whose dad died suddenly of a massive heart attack out of the blue. My parents weren't so lucky. My brother's death, on the other hand, was the easiest and most peaceful. However, his downfall was still long, ugly, and gross. This nuclear family really began in 1973, the year my parents met and the year that they married. They only knew each other for 3 months, but they were almost 30, so I think that's why they rushed into it. They then lived together for just shy of 40 years. So I wasn't a child of divorce like my wife, so I don't know what that is like. Those two were always present in my life until they died. They did manage to restrain themselves for 2 years before my mom became pregnant. It was a purposeful act of procreation. My mom came from a large Irish Catholic family of 8 kids. She had 3 older sisters, 2 of whom were identical twins, and they each had 6 children. The sister she was closest with, my Aunt Carolyn, had 4. So it probably seemed natural to have kids of her own. But she did it later in life, and thankfully only had 2. The youngest sister also only had 2 kids. She had 3 brothers, of which only one had kids, again, just 2. Her 2 child-free brothers now share a gravestone right next to my brother and my parents, who also share a stone. Her 2 brothers are both in the Army, thus the American flags. I had paid for the monument company to come and chisel the year 2021 on my parents' stone for my mom, but they still haven't finished it yet when I recorded this. My dad was born in Detroit in 1944, the same year as my mom. So both of my parents were born during World War II instead of after, so they were actually older than baby boomers. The worst war in human history was underway, and both of my grandparents thought that it was a great idea to bring more people into this world at war. Pretty hard to imagine. Like my mom's parents, my dad's folks were in their 30s when they had him. So the fact that both of my parents had older parents, and the fact that they themselves were in their 30s when they had me, meant that I didn't get to spend much time with any of my grandparents. My last one to die was my dad's mom, Eloise, who died during my first year in college. My dad had one brother, but he was born with a physical defect, and he died age 11. My My dad was very heartbroken by his brother's death, as were my grandparents, and there were pictures of my uncle all over the place in my grandparents' home. Dad, or Pops as he liked to be called, always called or sent me an email on his brother's birthday. I never knew him, of course, but Pops wanted to remind me that he existed. His final request of me was to spread his ashes on his brother's grave, which is in a small city in Upper Michigan where his family moved. So I complied with his wishes, but my mom also wanted part of his remains to be next to hers in the family cemetery here in southeastern Michigan, so I only buried half of him up in Alpena. That little gathering of my dad's cousins around his brother's now over 60-year-old gravestone was the closest thing we had to a funeral for either of my parents. My dad said that he didn't want a funeral, and my mom didn't want to have a drunken party, although I know that my dad would have wanted that. So we didn't do anything. My mom, although a Catholic, never requested last rites or a Catholic service. Due to the COVID pandemic, I decided not to do anything. The last Catholic Mass I went to was in 2015 for my brother's funeral. I found it so distasteful that I'd prefer never to experience that again. My mom said that Brett would have wanted a Catholic ceremony, so that's why we did it. I talk about his funeral more in my video, Why I Am an Atheist. As I mentioned, Mom came from a large Irish Catholic family. My ancestors came from Cork, Ireland, and came to the US in the 1820s. A decade or so later, the ancestors on my dad's side were emigrating from Shropshire, England, which is just north of Wales, to Canada. My great-great-grandfather would then become one of the first white men to permanently settle in what would become the state of Michigan. My dad's father was a real old-school alcoholic son of a bitch. He'd go on benders for weeks where my grandmother and dad would have to leave and stay with relatives. No one could convince her to leave. My grandmother's sister lived to be 102. I just went to her funeral in June of this year. She never had anything nice to say about her brother-in-law. My dad said he probably cursed my brother Brett by making his middle name Stuart after my grandpa. Why he named his son after his asshole father, I'm not sure, but it must have been in a bid for approval. His dad was impossible to impress. He resented that my dad went to college and became more educated than he was. I remember once when my grandmother took me to the store to buy Grandpa's, quote, medicine. That was the first time I'd ever heard of liquor being called medicine. I feel a little bit ashamed that I cried at his funeral, but I was very young, and it was my first experience seeing a dead body. My grandmother took a hold of my hand and put it on his dead chest. "See," she said, "he's cold." I never had any bad interactions with my mom's dad. He seemed overall to be nice. But other than a hug hello and goodbye, I never really got to know him. My mom's mom was also a bit distant, but kind. She always made sure my brother and I had ginger ale and the Sunday comics that she would save for us. My dad really liked his in-laws, I'm guessing more than his own fucked up family, and they liked him back. We just walked in the door after the 5-hour drive down from Alpena after my Grandpa Stu's funeral, when the phone rang informing us that my Grandpa Clyde had died. They died 3 days apart. I didn't know what to think, but I was extremely upset. I was 12 at the time. I grew up next to a cemetery where all of the original people who settled in my neighborhood were buried, so I was aware of death at a young age, but it still never fails to shake me up. My mom's dad, my Grandpa Clyde, was where I got my first experiences with nursing homes. It certainly made an impression, and I could even say that just that experience alone made me into an antinatalist. My brother and dad would not accompany us on these trips, so my mom just brought me. I wonder if she knew or even thought about how it would affect me. My grandfather had lost the ability to speak, so we mostly just sat there and watched the poor senile seniors shout and shuffle their final months alive away. Life didn't seem to be very beautiful after that. I'll spare you the details, but I saw many disgusting, disturbing things during that time, and I just feel sick thinking about it. I feel like death has always been a prominent part of my life. In my first video, I talked about how much the death of my first pet, a goldfish, affected me. Life just seemed to get grayer and grayer after that. When I first got into comic books, the big story arc in Batman at the time was called A Death in the Family. One of the saddest comic stories I've ever read, and that was my introduction to Batman comics. It featured the death of Jason Todd, the second Robin, because Dick Grayson was all grown up at that point. This story really made an impression on me, as did the character of Batman. He realized that he'd have to be crazy to put a young person's life in danger like that. He made a tribute to Jason in the Batcave so he would never forget. To my dismay, they introduced a new Robin much too soon afterwards. I thought that clearly this was the perfect opportunity to get rid of Robin for good. I never was much of a fan, honestly. To me, Robin died in Batman number 428. DC Comics ridiculously brought him back from the dead many years later, but I don't accept those stories. That story, A Death in the Family, taught a valuable lesson, and it should have been left at that. Don't put someone else in harm's way. I thought it was a great character development for Batman, but the stories in his books were very dark for a few years as he was racked with guilt. Considering his violent childhood, it is somewhat surprising how my dad turned out. He knew that he didn't want to stay in a small town like Alpena. He eventually went to law school, dropped out, and then traveled the world. He had a problem with the lack of ethics in law. He didn't feel like he could practice it. And sorry for another Batman tangent, but that is another memorable moment for me in my early comics reading. When Bruce Wayne went to law school, he learned that justice and the law are not the same. My dad was a voracious reader, even as a child, and he became determined to see the places he read about. He never got to India, Antarctica, or China, but he'd been just about everywhere else. He even tried to get to Antarctica from New Zealand, but the weather wouldn't permit it. Red China was off limits to Americans in the 60s. So he always had lots of interesting stories to tell. I did not inherit my dad's wanderlust. I would like to see some of the places he talked about, but if I never do, I'm fine with that. My dad gave me a love of geography and history. I just love looking at maps because he would drill me on countries and capitals daily. Sometimes Dad would come to my school and give talks on history. I wish that he had just done more writing. Now all of that knowledge and experience he accrued in his life is gone forever. My dad was not an angel, of course. He did beat me, as did my mom. But despite those beatings, I do think that my parents were generally decent people. The way Mendham described his parents, I basically feel the same way. They weren't criminals. They were always willing to help other people. Generous and giving were two words that people would often use to describe them. They did what they could to help me through college by letting me live at home. But their generosity ended up ruining my brother. And I suppose that is one of the points I'm trying to make with this video, that even parents with good intentions can cause havoc and disaster. Brett was born 2 years and 9 months after me. Both of my parents would later state, without me coaxing them in any way, that having him was a tragic mistake. My dad blamed my mom. With a TMI way that he is fond of, he said, "Well, son, she dropped the towel. What was I supposed to do?" He got a vasectomy after Brett was born, but by then it was too late. Although thankfully that limited the size of the family to 4. I don't know what they would have done, we only had 3 bedrooms. My mother said that she had him so that I could have a friend. But even when we were kids, she realized I would have been better off alone. I was solitary and didn't mind being alone with my books. Not that he and I didn't get along most of the time, and of course shared many childhood memories together, but I always felt like I was managing him. I had to constantly worry about his welfare. Once when he got lost at the mall, I was beside myself with panic. Letting go of him when it was clear that I could no longer protect him in any way was probably the hardest detachment of my life. That includes long-time relationships with girls and saying goodbye to my beloved pets. It started when I was just starting college. Brett came home without the used car that my parents had bought for him. This was at least the second or third vehicle that they had bought him. Big mistake. He kept crashing them. He really had no business being behind the wheel. He is probably the most irresponsible and reckless person I've ever known. The story he came up with, and what I believed at first, was that he got kidnapped by 2 thugs who forced him to drive to the projects and when one of them got out of the car, he supposedly ran away and just left the car. It was recovered a few days later with the interior filthy. Then it happened again, and my parents and I realized that Brett was a liar, and what really happened was that he was trading his car for drugs. I do think that there was probably something genetically wrong with him. My parents were older when they had him, in their mid-late 30s, so he could have just been a bad egg. My dad was a smoker, and I doubt that helped his DNA. Another way my parents failed him was by putting him on Ritalin at a young age. I've heard of studies where going on drugs early in life prepares a person for addiction as an adult. He couldn't even finish high school. My parents sent him to a private school, but he still couldn't graduate. But he did finally get his GED, which amazed me. The one thing he was good at was something that doesn't have much value: skateboarding. He loved skateboarding like no other thing. That obsession happened when my mom bought him a U70 style skateboard at a garage sale. And the rest is history. He never stopped. After I fell on my head a couple of times, that was enough for me. But even through broken bones and pints of blood, he kept at it. He did actually sort of achieve his dream for a short time. He became sponsored by a skateboard shop in San Francisco, the skateboarding mecca, and so in his eyes, he was a professional. But all he got out of it were some free skateboards. He never actually made money doing it. But you can see from this video that he was pretty good. But it's a very competitive, like all sports, and he had no chance against the real pros. Because of all of his injuries, opiates became his drug of choice, and that's what killed him in the end. Once he was an addict, and back in Michigan, he was the bane of my parents' existence. He would send dealers over to their house to collect his drug debts, which of course freaked the hell out of them. My dad sold his beloved coin collection in a lump sum at a huge loss because Brett knew about it, and he was afraid that someone would break into the house to steal it. When I first moved out of my parents' house, I used to let him come over. But every time he would steal something. When he would, quote, go to the bathroom, he would mysteriously disappear, and I would have to go find out which room he was in looking for something to steal. So when I moved again, I never told him my address or phone number. If I felt like seeing him, I would just drop by where he was staying. Usually when I would visit, I would just be beside myself with shock. I went to his apartment one night just to check in on him, and his door had been broken off its hinges. He was sitting there in the middle of a trashed room, shit everywhere. His mattress had been slit open. He was so glad to see me, but I was horrified. He said that the police just upended his place looking for drugs. The next time I visited him was at another apartment that my foolish parents were paying for. And showing that he had learned nothing from his previous experience, he was in the midst of separating powdered heroin into little plastic baggies. I didn't visit him anymore after that, and soon after that he went to jail for a year. That year was one of peace for my parents and I. We didn't have to worry about him. I never visited him in jail. He sent me a rude woe is me letter that I could hardly believe. I did write him back, but I never ended up sending it. I tried to firmly talk sense into him, but I knew that he'd probably just rip it up and be even more pissed at me for not understanding him. He was a very charismatic person. That's why he always had girlfriends who were out of his league. Because he could charm them initially, and he was good looking. But his relationships, like his jobs, never lasted. Eventually, they would discover that he was entirely self-obsessed. It is a shame that he never got to use his talents for anything useful. He would have made a good actor. I always preferred to be behind the camera, and he had no problem being in front of it. But he was unmanageable. I could get him to do something for a very short period of time, that's it. So he used his talents to scam people instead. He could talk a stranger into giving him money that he had no intention of ever paying back. He even scammed me a couple of times, but at least I knew that I would never see my money again. He could also turn on the waterworks in a matter of seconds if he thought it would help him. For my dad, having a son in jail was terrible. He was deeply ashamed and wondered what he did wrong. My mother got into Al-Anon. It's AA for family members of addicts. At least she had the support of other people in her situation. Certainly helping him financially since he was a teenager was a terrible idea, and they were never able to fully let him go. They would give tough love for a few months by cutting him off, but they always gave in. So since he didn't have a job, he would just become a skateboarding drug addict criminal and never have to fully support himself. He was never able to hold a job for more than a couple of months. He would either steal or fight with another employee or just not show up. My parents would later apologize to me that they spent so much more time and money on him than they did me. One thing my dad gave me was a work ethic. Somehow Brett never got it. My dad forced me to get a job when I was 15, and I just never stopped because after that job ended, he helped me find another one. I knew that if I wasn't working, he wasn't happy, so I worked through high school and college. I did not enjoy serving my classmates hamburgers, but having some money for gas did give me a small amount of freedom. My dad was a workaholic, and he usually found something to do on the weekends for extra money. I'll go with him on his weekend jobs sometimes. I like spending time with him. He felt more like an equal than a boss. I got along well with my parents. They were probably my closest friends. I'd drive over to their house every weekend to see them. Whomever I was dating got to know them as well. I feel bad for my wife because as soon as she got to know them, they were gone. My mom stuck around longest, but the person she used to be died long before her body died. And as much as I love them and miss them, I can never forgive them for what they did, for bringing me into this horrible place and abandoning me here. But also for all the spankings, the slaps, the put-downs. But both of my parents were hit by their parents, and the cycle just repeats itself. I never, ever, ever thought that striking a child was something I would ever want to do. So for that reason alone, I never wanted to do this stupid hobby of raising kids. I was still living at home and going to school, so I was available when my dad asked me to drive him to a doctor's appointment. It was one of those days I remember very well, like what the waiting room looked like and what book I was reading. Neither of us thought it was a big deal. Then all of a sudden, doctors started coming out and talking to me frantically, and immediately I got alarmed. They thought that my dad was in imminent danger. When I went in to see him, he looked shell-shocked. I had never seen his face like that. The doctor had just informed him that he had 5 years to live at most. He was 54 at the time, so of course it was a shock. So everything changed after that. His attitude changed, his whole life changed. He went on disability, and the workaholic father I had known was replaced by a sedentary man on oxygen. His lungs were basically shot. He had emphysema, or what is now called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Essentially, he could inhale, but could not exhale. I only saw him feel self-pity once. A week or so after that diagnosis, he saw me in a good mood and had to knock me down a peg by saying, "Matt, don't you understand? I'm going to die." Yeah, we're all going to die, and mine might be worse than yours. But I didn't say that. I just said, I know. I feel for you. He smoked for decades. What the fuck do you expect? However, he refused to blame his smoking and instead blamed it on the fact that he was a premature birth. That was the reason why he was blind in one eye. He had to live in an incubator and the oxygen was too high. This was the reason why many kids from the 40s ended up blind. Or the fact that he worked in a cement plant and a steel mill for years before he went back to school and became a hospital administrator. Who knows what caused it, but the doctors were wrong and he ended up living for 15 more years. But every single year he got worse until he couldn't breathe anymore. Watching him go through it is not a death I would welcome. He was in hospice for about 1 week. He was completely awake and aware for the first day. He requested I get him a Wall Street Journal and the 3 books he was currently reading. Then when I came in the next day, he was completely out. He woke up one more time before passing out again, and he whispered to me that he was reliving his life. I was not with him when he died, but his best friend was. He was very loyal to his friends, and they were in turn very loyal to him. Before he died, he made many arrangements for my mom as he could. Not long after his diagnosis, my parents went on a trip to Florida, and while there, my mom experienced an unusual blackout. She wasn't a drinker, so they had no idea what was going on. She just didn't remember her trip, so something clearly was wrong. She didn't have any tremors yet, but she got the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease soon after. She also had one moment of self-pity where she said, "Why me?" 10 years earlier, my mom had to have a life-saving operation on her brain and skull for a very rare condition. As a side effect of that operation, one of her vocal cords was paralyzed, so she couldn't speak for over a year. She had to have a second surgery, this time in her neck, to try and fix the problem. She eventually did learn to speak again, but this was years and years of struggle for her. So to go through all of that, and then this, I can totally understand her frustration. But Parkinson's is much, much worse, even though her earlier diagnosis could have killed her. It would have been better if she had died before the Parkinson's really took hold. I could make a whole series of videos about her slow decline. My dad put an addition on the house I grew up in so that my mom wouldn't have to go downstairs for the laundry anymore. But she didn't get to enjoy it for very long. My brother died only 2 years after my dad, and it was then that I noticed her mental state really decline. I was trying to show her how to use her cell phone and just kept repeating and repeating myself. She said, I know, I should be getting this, but her memory was just gone. After my brother's funeral, I was following her in the car, and I was horrified that she kept crossing the center line. I was just like, oh God, come on, just a few more miles to a dirt road where there'll be less cars. And that day we took away the keys and the car, because she scared me half to death. The breaking point wasn't long after that when my neighbor called me at work and said that my mom was lost in the neighborhood and was unable to find her house. I also found out that day that instead of undressing herself, she had been cutting herself out of her clothes with scissors. I realized that she could no longer stay in the house by herself anymore. As her only child, now I had to take over her life. It was an unwelcome burden, and one that I can still hardly believe I had to do. Obviously, I had never done this before, so I had to enlist services like A Place for Mom to help me. I was afraid that she would resist this change to assisted living, but thankfully she went along with it. I found her an apartment nearby and then set about selling my childhood home. Thankfully, she had friends who greatly helped in this huge endeavor. 40 years of stuff had to be sold, sorted, donated, or thrown out. I'm still going through it as much of it moved to my house. So now that I want to move, I have to go through all of my parents' things again. Part of that process is scanning the photos that you're seeing in this video. And this is just a small selection. She was quite the shutterbug, even though her cameras were always just cheap Kodak Instamatics or Fuji disposable cameras. She loved taking pictures. After that initial struggle, life somewhat returned to normal. My wife and I visited her every Sunday. That was around the time I made my first antinatalist video and talked about her situation. But the easy times didn't last for long. Slowly, but not imperceivably slowly, the disease took its course and she got worse pretty much every time I saw her. She would microwave some popcorn until it burned, forget how to turn the TV on, and worst of all, forget to take her medication. Parkinson's disease destroys the body's ability to make dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and without it, the brain can't successfully control movement and coordination. That is why people with this disease have tremors. The only drug known to treat Parkinson's is levodopa. It gets converted to dopamine in the brain, but it has to be taken several times a day. We were aghast when we saw that even though I had all of the medications sorted in daily pill boxes, she was not taking them. So this began the long process of slowly adding more and more services to our bill. She had to have someone watch her, take her meds, and also prepare her food and see that she drank water every day because she couldn't do any of those things anymore. Nobody I knew personally had to deal with this alone. This being the only child and having to rescue a parent who was slowly losing her mind and the ability to walk and talk. Sort of hate to say it, but my brother would not only have been no help during this, he would have made it much worse and more stressful, so I can't say that I was sad that he wasn't around. Obviously, I had to take over my mom's financial affairs because she would have done something reckless, and there was no reason for her to have money. Everything was taken care of. She She kept asking, though, because she was so giving, she wanted to help the other residents. I had to keep telling her that I would take care of it. This role reversal was very uncomfortable for me. I hated seeing my own mother in a childlike state when she was always the one I would turn to when I was in trouble. It got really bad, though. She had to be restrained by a high chair for the same reason why a toddler has to be restrained. She would just fall over and crack her head open. My mother had more black eyes than anyone I ever knew. It was not an infrequent occurrence, so they had to restrain her, which was very hard for me to deal with because she would plead with me to let her out. But I'm just not the type of person who's going to help my mother use the bathroom. I just couldn't do that, so I'd go and get help, and that's what we're paying them for, so why not use them? I was very fortunate to find the place that I did. The caregivers were kind, and it was their job to keep the residents occupied all day. I have so many photos of Mom from this place because posting them to a Facebook page was one of their included services. I slept a little easier at night. Mom's memory was worse every time I saw her. Finally, she did forget my name, but she still knew who I was. When she forgot that I was married, then I knew things had really changed, and that was the beginning of the end. She moved to another building on the campus that suited her needs better, and soon hospice care followed. She had been on hospice before, but seemingly got better, but this second time it was for real. The nurse called me and told me that Mom couldn't speak or move. She had become paralyzed by her disease. Everything else pales in comparison to seeing her like that and not being able to do much to help her. The plan was to allow her to starve and dehydrate to death. A few years earlier, Mom had broached the topic of suicide. She said, "I wish I could just die now." She was so right, and it is a regret of mine that I didn't push it more. I just felt like this was her life, and if she wanted help ending it, then of course I would help. But it was never more than a notion. I had researched Parkinson's disease. I knew it would be ugly, but I just sat there and let it happen. Now it was too late. I just had to wait for her to die. My wife and I would go there every day and just talk to her, play some of her favorite music, hug her, and kiss her, but she couldn't respond. Tears did stream down her face, though. I know that she could hear me. The nurses kept her somewhat comfortable with morphine, but her eyes and mouth never closed. It was the disease. The eyelids are controlled by muscles, and her muscles wouldn't respond to her brain's signals anymore. The day that she died, I was told by the nurse that she was close and I should come down immediately. So my wife and I went in, and she died right in front of us. All of this was torture for me and my wife as well. I nearly went crazy. I had a complete nervous breakdown in February of 2020 and had to take extended time off work. This is the urn Mom picked out for herself before her dementia set in. I almost certainly get my morbid sense of humor from her. She bought this before she was even diagnosed. I have a collection of tote bags from the Cremation Society of Michigan now. This is the third time I've been there. As I was writing this video, I finally buried my mom. My final grisly task was to pour her cremains, just her ground up teeth and skeleton, from the funeral home plastic bag into the urn, making sure not to spill or inhale any. Some families have an elaborate ceremony to bury the ashes. I was going to have a thing for the burial, but I didn't really want to deal with it, and my wife said, "Well, don't then." While I was there, I planted some perennials because I plan on leaving this state soon, and I'd like there to be blooming flowers every year. My parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, brother, and 2 uncles are all here. My parents were forward-thinking, which helped me. Their cremations and even Brett's were all prepaid in advance. My brother was the only one to have a Catholic funeral service because he wanted it. Besides my mom's indoctrination, he was indoctrinated again by Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. After he got out of jail, Brett remarkably was sober for 1.5 years. I admit I was proud of him, but I knew that it wouldn't last. I just didn't expect that when he fell off the wagon, he would die doing so. He was dating a girl who was really good for him, but she was a little bit overweight, so he dumped her for a slimmer girl who was also a recovering addict, and I think that decision sealed his fate. Going by his final text messages, it appears that he was planning on picking her up from work, and then they'd go back to his place and get high together. But she told him that she had to work longer, so he went home and did all the heroin himself. Little did he know that it was laced with fentanyl, and that's what killed him. I sometimes wonder if she's still alive. The song "I'm the End of the Family Line" by Morrissey came out when I was a teenager, and that is what I always wanted, to be the last. As Morrissey says, "Our family tree hacked into decline, and I'm spared the pain of ever saying goodbye." Meaning to me that he'll never have to leave children to fend for themselves after he's dead. I always loved that song and wanted it to be true for me. It wasn't really true for Morrissey either, as he had cousins who will carry on the family name. In that way, I'll be the last of this line. Sadly, I'll not be the end of my parents' genetics, as my brother sired a daughter. But true to his nature, he pulled a Steve Jobs and never acknowledged her. But I have seen pictures of her on Facebook, and there is no doubt that she is his offspring. She looks just like him, but as a girl. Same green eyes, same Roman nose. So naturally, it will be his genetics that go forward in the future. I was planning on offering to pay for his vasectomy, but I just never got the chance. And it feels weird to have a niece out there. She doesn't have my last name, of course, because Brett wasn't in her life. So that will be the last legacy of my parents, whatever she does with her life, and the people that she brings into existence, which she almost certainly will, on and on through the decades and centuries. If they had decided to just stick with having a dog, then none of us would be here to suffer and die. Hundreds of thousands of dollars wouldn't have been spent on dental care, petroleum, food, entertainment, hospice, Parkinson's drugs, nurses, rehab, cremation. The list goes on and on. Also, I could be here today to write about how silly it all was. Silly and completely pointless. Sadly, I feel like most parents think that they are either continuing a majestic dynasty or they're starting one. They really can't see past their own glory and how their ridiculous egos will affect other people for possibly hundreds of years. So I really hope that at least one potential parent will see this video and think about the repercussions of letting a pregnancy go full term. There is no shame in getting pregnant. It's staying pregnant that is the crime. I was thinking of that sticker I would see on rented VHS tapes. Be kind, rewind. It was kind to rewind because you're doing a favor for the next person who rents the tape. So how about, be kind, don't leave a child behind. You were imposed upon. Don't keep that imposition going. That is the plan of every parent. They know that they are likely to predecease their child, so the plan all along is to abandon them in a cruel world. Procreation is like holding a child's hand down into hell and then leaving them there. They get so upset when their child dies first because they didn't want to be the one to have to deal with it. They wanted their child to have to deal with their death instead. They don't want to plan a funeral. That's their kid's job. And they really don't want to be faced with the fact that they created a tragedy. All parents are going to do by breeding is turn themselves into the Grim Reaper. Potential parents, you don't want to be a killer of children, do you? The world is so fucked up. Billions of little horror shows happening every minute, and you really want to bring someone into this? For what purpose? The tradition of reproducing and parenting is not something that's going to enrich your life. It's a massive liability, not just for you, but for the future. It's the biggest mess that most people make of their lives and the lives of others. It's not a constructive hobby, it's destructive. We judge stories by their endings. If the ending sucks, then the movie sucks. I just want to forget this whole story now because the ending was disappointing to say the least. Horrific is a better word. The thing my parents created now has died. And what good did it do? Now I want to flee this state that I've lived in for my entire life because I am drowning in painful memories here. Maybe I'll get over it someday, or maybe I won't. One thing I certainly will never do is impose life on any more Matts and Bretts.
there's no living in my life anymore. The seas have gone dry and the rain stopped falling. Please don't you cry anymore. Can't you see? Listen to the breeze, whisper to me, please don't send me to the path of nevermore. Even in the valleys below, where the rays of the sun were so warm and tender, now haven't anything to grow. Can't you see? Why did you have to leave me? Why did you deceive me? You sent me to the path of nevermore. When you say you didn't love